vulnerability is going to be possible in ColdFusion. You can make the same mistakes. It'll look different in code, but you can make all the same mistakes. ColdFusion has a lot of dangerous tags that can enable this. It makes it a little bit easier for people to make mistakes, making it easy for them to access the file system or the registry, not have to write a lot of code to accomplish that, to just put it in a tag. So it's maybe more likely that people will do dangerous things, but there's nothing really unique about what the vulnerabilities, how the vulnerabilities manifest themselves in ColdFusion. So we're not going to talk a lot about that. So earlier we were talking about ColdFusion components and the idea that you can have functions that are accessible remotely, and I wanted to show you what that looked like. So foo.cfc is a ColdFusion component that we have on the server, and basically any method in that CFC file is a potential entry point if it's defined the right way. So the example URL up there says, we'll load a method called xyzzy in foo.cfc and then pass it these two arguments. And as you can see, it's just all done on the query string there. You can also pass the arguments in the post body as opposed to the get, but the method name actually has to be in the get. Flexibility, I guess. And then there are various things that happen if the method doesn't exist or if the method's not specified. And it goes into some of those error handling methods or on-missing method that's going to be in application.cfc. What to look for here is in any CFC, if you're doing a code review or if you're writing a CFC, you have to define the function using the CF function tag. And at the bottom there you can see access equals remote. If you're setting this thing up to be a web service, you have to set it to access remote because it has to be accessed over the web remotely. But if you're just setting up the function such that it's going to be called by another ColdFusion page, it doesn't need to be remote. Right? You can leave that attribute off, and by default it'll be set to public, which means other pages can access it, but it can't be accessed remotely. Sometimes people will turn on access remote for testing purposes and not turn it off. Sometimes they'll misinterpret what remote actually means, so they'll think that it has to be remote for another page to call it. So there's common developer mistakes. So can't really fault ColdFusion for this, for stupid mistakes. But watch for that attribute. So if you say access remote, then it's something that can be called remotely, especially if it's something that's sensitive, that's only intended to be called by other pages, and you can call it directly, like changing somebody's permissions or accessing part of an application that you shouldn't otherwise be able to access. That would be dangerous. Okay, getting back to variable scopes, and this gets a little confusing here, but before we talked about all the different variable scopes that exist within ColdFusion, and that you can call them by explicitly specifying the scope. For example, cookie.something will look in the cookie scope only. But what happens if you specify a variable without a scope? What happens in that case? Again, remember the overarching theme here, which is ColdFusion was designed to be easy to use. So they don't want to throw an error message when that occurs because that makes it more difficult to use. So what happens if you specify a ColdFusion expression such as like hash foo hash without a scope, it's going to go through a search order. And it's going to go through a bunch of different scopes in order looking for a variable called foo. And if it finds one, it'll use it. If it doesn't find one, it'll move on to the next scope. There are actually 12 scopes that it searches through. These are the ones that are probably the most relevant. So they're in the proper relative order, but there are some other ones that are sprinkled throughout there. Like if you have, if you're inside a query loop, for example, that falls into earlier on in the scope. But these are kind of the important ones because they're the ones that are like CGI, URL, form, cookie client. Those are the ones that are most often tainted. So, for example, kind of a side effect of this search order is that if you have an application that doesn't specifically use scoping, you can almost always override form parameters with get parameters because the search order will look at the get parameter first. It'll, URL is number 3, form is number 4. So if it reaches, if it sees a variable by the same name in both scopes, it's going to hit the URL one first. Question? Do you know where the request falls in this list? I don't know offhand. Not all scopes are included in the search order, so some scopes actually do have to be specified explicitly, and they will never be searched.
I'm not sure request is in there.
Yeah, I don't think it is either. If you in the white paper, we have a link to the part of the documentation that has like all 12 that are searched. We just didn't fit them all on here. But yeah, some scopes do have to be specified explicitly, and they'll never be just like automatically searched. So one thing that you should do if you're developing an application, or if you have access to the code for an application that you're reviewing, is just look for any scoping inconsistencies. So what I mean by that is, number one, any case where unscoped variables are used, but more importantly, any case where there's a mismatch between places where scoping is used and is not used. So if they write a variable, if they set a variable using a scope, and then they read that same variable later without a scope, that's a potential attack point, because they're making an assumption at the point of the read that it's going to be reading only the variable that they set. But in reality, it may actually be reading a different variable that the user can control. We have a few examples of that coming up. Okay, this is a really, really simple contrived example. Most of these examples are pretty contrived for the sake of fitting on the slide. But here's a case where, let's say the application has a variable called important var, and earlier on in the application somewhere, some logic was executed, and if a certain set of conditions were met, it set the variable called important var. And then later, we have this code, which checks to see if that variable is present. And if it is present, they're making the assumption, right, that it was set by the application itself earlier on, after whatever logical check that it made. So it says, if defined important var, then go ahead and do this important stuff. Otherwise, print an error message that says you're not allowed to access the functionality. So they're making an assumption here that if they see a variable called important var, then the application must have created it. But that's not true, because of the fact that they didn't use scoping. So if I just put important var equals anything in the URL, or the post body, or a cookie, or basically anything in the search order that I control, that check for is defined is going to come back true, and it's going to execute the do important stuff function. The application developer doesn't realize that that's happening, because they think that it's only going to be defined if they defined it. So that's one danger of doing that. If they had done isDefined variables dot important var, then it would have only checked the variable scope, and it wouldn't have checked any of the other user-controlled scopes. Here's another one. So you have the logic up at the top of the page to process a user login. So it says it authenticates the user, checks the username and password, and it also calls a function called isAdministrator on the username to figure out whether the user is an admin. So basically, if they authenticate and they're an admin, then it sets a variable using cfset called client.admin, and it sets it to true. Otherwise, it sets client.admin to false. So far, so good. And that's the type of code that might be in an application.cfm page, something that gets called before every page in the application, right? Commonly used for access controls and things like that. Now, later in the application, you have other pages that then go in back and check that admin variable and make sure that it's true before allowing the user to do any restricted things. So there's a potential check that might be carried out later in the program. CF if admin equals true, and it checks to see if the variable admin is called true, is set to true. You've probably already figured out by now that the mismatch there is that you're setting it with client.admin, but you're reading it with an unscoped variable. So it's not going to look at just client.admin, it's going to go through that search order. And if I put admin equals true in the URL, it's going to hit that URL scope before it gets down to the client scope. If you remember, client scope is number 6. Right? So if I have any variable that's called admin earlier on in the search order than the client scope, then the application is going to use that one instead. And that's why I can just put admin equals true in the URL, and it will bypass that check. And I could put admin equals true anywhere in the search order. So again, it's a really easy thing to look for. I'm just looking for the fact that I'm setting client.admin, but I'm just reading admin. Really easy to find. Really common mistake, but easy to search for. Undefined variables are another case, sort of related to unscoped variables, but kind of related to the fact that there are similar tags in ColdFusion that you might think do the same thing, but they don't. And the two of these that are most often confused are CFParam and CFSet. CFParam basically looks for a variable and figures out if it's not already set. And if it's not already set, then it will assign a value. CFSet will always make an assignment regardless of whether or not there's already a value there. So we have an example of some, again, a contrived code snippet. Let's say you have CFParam, name equals pagenum, default equals 1. What that's going to do is it's going to say, well, if pagenum is not already defined, then assign it the value 1. And then you have a CF output tag that prints some stuff on the page. It says, now showing page 1. Easy, right? Well, the developer may be assuming that the value is always going to be 1 unless it's unless they've already set it to something else. But basically, it's going to be exploitable in scenarios where, again, you put a variable called pagenum in the URL or the post body or in a scope that you control. Because what's going to happen is the CFParam is going to execute, and then it's going to say, oh, well, pagenum already exists. Pagenum already contains, script, alert, whatever. And it's not going to assign the value 1. So this is really more of a confusion between what different tags do. Environment variables, you have a CGI scope that we talked about before. And this is similar to other CGI scopes in different application development platforms, except that in ColdFusion, you can actually manipulate a whole lot more than you can in other platforms. So normally, you can alter CGI.queryString or CGI.host. In ColdFusion, you can manipulate almost everything in the CGI scope. So for example, CGI.httphost in a normal request is going to contain whatever's in the host header. But if you provide a host header and an HTTP header that's actually called HTTP host, that will override the value of CGI HTTP host, and it will actually contain in the lower code snippet there evil.com instead of example.com. I have no idea why it does that, why they allow you to do that. There appears to be no defensible reason for allowing you to overwrite CGI variables, but there you have it. You can actually create any HTTP header, so it can be HTTP header called foo, and that will create a variable in the CGI scope called cgi.foo. Nobody knows why. More dangerously, you can override things that in other application development platforms you can never override. You can, if you have a ASP.NET or Java page, you can never override server software or path info or some of these other things that are generally defined on the server side and considered immutable. And there are a lot that you can actually override just by using an HTTP header. You can override CGI.authUser, which doesn't seem like something you should be able to override, but yet you can. If you're deploying this in a situation where you're using basic auth or NTLM auth and the actual authenticated username is stored in a CGI variable, you want to make sure not to use auth user. You want to make sure to use remote user. It'll be populated the same way for either one, but remote user is not overridable, and auth user is. Again, no idea why. And then finally, before we get into the Java stuff, persistence issues. We talked about the client scope before and the fact that you could configure that to be using the registry or the cookies. And essentially, if they have it defined, or if you have client management enabled and you have client variables set to use cookies, then tampering is always going to be possible. Just you can poison any cookie. That's a well-known fact. But oftentimes, the developer will just say, "Well, I'm using client scope variables to persist data across multiple visits to the site." They may not actually know how that works, right? It's a black magic a lot of the time, but it's actually in a cookie. So if you put something sensitive in a client scope variable and you're not realizing as a developer that it's in the cookie, then that may open up the application to some really, really simple cookie poisoning attacks. The cookie that's used for the client scope variables is not encrypted in any way. There's no MAC, there's no HMAC. Everything is in plain text. It's delimited by, I forget, but there's basically a name-value pair with delimiters, and it can be manipulated in whatever